The first and most important political and economic reality to recognize is that all, without exception, all industrial nations are rapidly degrading and dissipating their life-sustaining resource base. In short, all of these nations, ours and all the rest, are consuming our capital assets, and counting it on the profit side of the ledger. The basic wealth of our nation, the basic wealth, the capital, the basic wealth of our nation is air, water, soil, forests, minerals, rivers, lakes, oceans, scenic beauty, wildlife habitat. Take it away, and all you got is a desert. Perhaps the most sacred tenet of capitalism is that you do not consume capital to pay for current expenses. Yet, unwittingly, or perhaps witlessly, the captains of industry and the free market entrepreneurs have been depleting the nation's capital resource base for so long, they are unaware that they are sowing the seeds that will destroy the system. Every business enterprise in history that consumed its capital and called it profit went bankrupt. Sovereign nations are no different. It will just take them longer to get there. Ironically, the most devastating commentary on our forestry practices came from Vladimir Malaznikov, a Soviet ecologist and botanist, who visited Oregon with a group of 7 scientists in last October, 1990. They came to learn about America's forward-looking, professional forestry practices. They were dismayed by what they saw. This is a quote from Mr. Malaznikov. I am a forest ecologist with 30 years experience in the forests of Siberia. Not long ago, I was able to visit the forests of Oregon. I went to different spots in the forest and saw the forest from the air, and I was stunned by the scale of logging. Well, the first time I saw it, I was stunned too. Then he continues, what I have seen in Oregon, in my deep conviction, won't make it possible to use your forest techniques as an example for us. Then he ended saying, I don't want to be misunderstood. I'm not trying to lecture Americans. All I care to do is in a friendly way warn you. Don't repeat our mistakes. Tremendous natural resource use and planned transformations of nature has led our system to the point of ecological crisis. The crisis is apparent even in Siberia. And with this crisis, as undeniable consequences, have come economic crises as well. Mr. Malaznikov's observation is all the more damning, coming from one who has witnessed it all firsthand and sees us blindly pursuing the same course, down the same path, to the same end. Tragically, the universal guiding ethic of the United States and all other industrial nations since the Industrial Revolution has been maximum exploitation of all resources with minimum concern for the environment. This guiding ethic has been quite precisely described by a Japanese journalist who was asked by ecologist Paul Ehrlich why the Japanese whaling industry is busily exterminating the very source of its wealth. The answer was this: you are thinking of the whaling industry as an organization interested in maintaining whales. Actually, it is better viewed as a huge quantity of capital attempting to earn the highest possible return. If it can exterminate whales in 10 years and make a 15% profit, but it could only make 10% with a sustainable harvest, then it will exterminate them in 10 years. After that, the money will be moved to exterminate some other resource. Well, Mr. Daly Mr. Daly, Herman Daly, cogently summarized this evolving tragedy when he said, quote, there is something fundamentally wrong in treating the earth as if it were a business in liquidation. Well, that's the way we've been treating it for quite some time.
I'm just one small representative of a large group of applied ecologists. And one of the things that applied ecologists have concerned themselves with for many years and do know how to do is how to predict very specifically the sustainable amount that you can harvest from any kind of living natural resource. What usually frustrates us in our discipline is that we can tell decision makers, which often are politicians, how to do this, but political pressures end up such that they ignore our specific recommendations, and so we end up with unsustainable use. My question to you, Mr. Daly, is what can applied ecologists like myself do to communicate better with the outside world and to be able to convince the decision makers about the importance of these kinds of tools? How can we help you, basically? And I say this also, I ask this question also partly because in our profession, we have to work every single day with the explicit recognition that there are limits to natural resources. That's just something that we live and breathe, so we understand that very well. I recognize we haven't done a good enough job of communicating that to the community around us, and I would be very interested in your suggestions on how to do that better.
If applied ecologists have concrete and better information, I really think it's important to get that out, because that's what economists are really need, is this biophysical budget, this notion of what it is you can take over, and I think it's very much analogous. I would like just to put a gun at the head of most ecologists and say, just give me a number. In the same way that a gun is put at the head of your income accountants, they are told, look, we have a practical problem here. We have to know how much we can consume this year without impoverishing ourselves in the future. Now, there's all kinds of really difficult theoretical questions and philosophical notions that make that very difficult. But just come up with a number. It may be wrong, but be conservative. Do so. And if ecologists would do the same thing, then I would be very happy, and it is greatly encouraging to me to hear that applied ecologists, more than theoretical ecologists, have actually done that.
Off the top of my head, I've seen numbers this week at our seminar of 2 species an hour being lost. We're talking an acre of wetland a minute being lost, things like this. And yet we know a name for maybe 3 to 10% of the species on the planet. So I just want to point out that we can't tell what's there when we're trying to value a piece of plot of land that should be developed or not. And we can't tell, even if we know what's there, we can't tell what value that species or ecosystem might attain in the future, or that might be recognized in the future. And I just want to point some of those things out, because underneath it all, given this rapid destruction, I think we have to rely, ecologists and hopefully economists, more even on the intuition that we have. And I think that's probably what underlies your attempt to come up with this index, is just to kind of give some kind of a voice or a number that the broader public can hear for an intuition, and rely more on something like Aldo Leopold's idea of just keeping all the pieces when we're tinkering.
I've been trying to think of ways of operationalizing sustainability, and one has to do with what you might call accounting rules for calculating rates of return or income on projects. If a project is based on the exploitation of renewable resources, then, as we were told earlier today, ecologists can tell us something about sustainable yield, and we can say that rules for that project, governing that project, should be that the offtake from the renewable resource which is being exploited should not be greater than the sustainable yield. So harvest rates should be within the capacity for regeneration of the resource, and the waste emission rates of the project should be within the capacity of the local ecosystem to absorb and assimilate in natural biogeochemical cycles. So those rules ought to be imposed as kind of accounting rules at the project level. For projects which exploit a non-renewable resource, we don't, one of those rules is still applicable. The waste emissions of the project still have to fit within the assimilative capacities of the local ecosystem. But there is no regenerative, natural regenerative rate for the input, which is non-renewable. So in the case of coal or petroleum or something, I would suggest a different kind of rule, that a part of the net revenue from that project, currently these projects do not, in calculating income, there is no reduction made for depletion of the resource. In many instances, there may be some differences. But I think what we need is to impose a depletion accounting at the firm level, and I would suggest, just for discussion, the following kind of a rule, that in depleting a non-renewable resource, some portion of the net receipts from that activity be set aside and reinvested in a long-term renewable substitute, so that as you're depleting the non-renewable, you are simultaneously building up a renewable substitute to a level such that by the time you've completely depleted the non-renewable resource, you will have built up the renewable substitute to a level such that its sustainable yield will be equal to the amount that you are consuming out of the non-renewable receipts each year. So you will have, in effect, made those receipts perpetual and thereby justify calling them and treating them as income in the calculation. So that this should be a discipline placed on projects which, now this is, I think, very controversial. There's plenty of room for argument about the range of substitution. What will qualify as a renewable substitute? If you're a standard neoclassical economist, you would say, well, anything. Put it in anything that yields a rate of return, that's a good enough substitute, do it that way. If you doubt that substitution is that easy, then you would want a closer and closer actual physical substitute to the thing itself. And this is extremely important because countries are making decisions on the basis of false information. I mean, if you treat income, you think you're richer than you are if you're not deducting something for deforestation and depletion of mines and wells. And so this is just the most, as Gaylord Nelson said last night, this is just the first cardinal rule of capitalism. It's the most basic, elementary, common sense accounting notion of separating capital from income and living off of income. So in that sense, what is being argued is extremely conservative and traditional. It's just that it hasn't been done. And that now all of the fraternity of national income accountants in the United Nations and elsewhere, because they've become accustomed to keeping accounts without really worrying about depletion of natural capital, because natural capital was assumed to be superabundant and you didn't have to worry about it. It wasn't scarce, so you didn't worry. Now, this change, even though logically it's so clear that that needs to be done, nevertheless, this runs against the principal cardinal virtue of the national income accounting fraternity, which is historical continuity with past accounts. So anything that disrupts that seems to cause great problems.
Amory and Hunter Lovins have given the lead in pointing out that more efficient use of energy could allow us to have all the end use we now have while reducing production. For example, simply by using more efficient electrical fixtures, we could light our homes just as brightly with 1/4 of the present energy use. Many electrical utilities have recognized that they can make better profits by subsidizing the shift of their customers to more energy efficient appliances. This is much cheaper than building new production facilities. Saving this money enables the utilities to provide electricity to customers at lower rates. The same general principles apply to the use of gasoline. If cars average 50 miles to the gallon, we could drive just as much with slowed exhaustion of resources and reduced pollution. As long as requirements are placed equally on all car makers, their opportunities for profits are not reduced. The time when they will have to abandon the internal combustion engine is postponed. It is true that there is much less support for this move among automakers in this country than for the analogous move among utilities. Nevertheless, it is in their long-term interest to support this approach. One would think that a move, or type of move, so universally advantageous would be a cornerstone of any national energy policy. But most of the steps the federal government could take to promote more efficient use of energy have been rejected by both the Reagan and the Bush administrations. One must ask, why? Part of the answer is, of course, the political power of particular economic interests. But I believe the deeper answer is that the dominant economic theory does not support this approach. According to that theory, our well-being is a function of total production and consumption. To light our homes equally well with less electricity, or to drive our cars just as far with less gas, shows up as reduced production and consumption on the Economist charts. The Denver Post, April 7th, 1991, ran an article on this topic featuring the achievements of Amory and Hunter Lovins in persuading business that its interests lay in using energy more efficiently. The tone of the article was generally laudatory. However, the concluding paragraphs turned to negative comments. Reagan's Secretary of Energy, James Edwards, it reported, asserted that we cannot conserve ourselves into prosperity. The implication, of course, is that only growth in production and hence increase of the use of resources can make us prosperous. The article continued, lately, critics of greater support for energy efficiency voice worry over the economic disruption they say would inevitably come with change, particularly if conservation is prodded by such government moves as tightening vehicle fuel efficiency standards. Quote, we need a national energy policy that is aimed at getting on with the job of producing more oil and gas at home to turn the wheels of industry and agriculture, unquote. Senator Phil Gramm, a Republican from oil-rich Texas, said in a recent television interview, conservation has got to be part of it too, Gramm said, but we need a balanced policy, and we can't act as if just simply passing a law saying that we'll raise energy standards on cars to 40 miles a gallon isn't costly. Such a change would cost tens of billions of dollars, hundreds of thousands of jobs. The suggestion in the Post is that Graham's reason for opposing energy efficiency as a major element of energy policy stemmed from the interests of Texas. Of course, that may be partly true. But I believe that they follow more from the fact that Graham is a first-rate economist. I assume, maybe the only one in Congress, I assume that the billions of dollars of cost are really the reduced GNP resulting from needing less oil. If the wheels of industry and agriculture are turned equally well with less use of gas and oil, GNP will go down. It is assumed that if GNP goes down, there will be fewer jobs. Since for economists, the only acceptable solution to unemployment is more rapid growth of the economy, the conclusion that using energy more efficiently costs jobs follows consistently. Given our present economic theory and its embodiment in practice, growth is essential to the economy. Most of the steps needed for the survival of a healthy planet are therefore perceived as threats to the economy. We urgently need reflection on how an economy that meets human need can function on the basis of using fewer resources.
There are all kinds of studies which give you many, many different columns, all of which are supposed to be different ways of finding out how well a society is doing. Our measure in no way replaces many other measures. But our argument was that in spite of the fact that all of these other measures have been available to policymakers for quite some time, in our society, the decisive measure always turns out to be the one that is put in dollar figures. and that therefore it was important to have one in dollar figures, which would include many elements that were not at present included in the GNP. So, but I still want to make it very clear that there are ours is not a social indicator. It has sometimes been described that way, but that's not our intention. Ours is an economic indicator, and economics is only one of the factors that makes for human welfare. In the whole book, we have emphasized the importance of community. Our measure does not give any expression to that very deep concern. In our book, we emphasize the fact that an anthropocentric vision is mistaken, that other creatures also have a place in reality that is not to be measured simply in relationship to human beings. Our measure ignores that completely. It's very conservative and limited in all those respects. So, having told you all the things it doesn't do and leaves out, consciously and intentionally leaves out, I still want to say, I do think it has the capacity to help break the addiction to one particular measure that has now for several decades simply dominated the discussion and had a profound and pernicious effect upon policy. So that's my claim for the index.
As a graduate student in both agricultural economics and environmental studies, I find myself, though, a bit ambivalent about the Index for Sustainable Economic Welfare. It's true, it's clear that the system of national accounts must be reformed, must be changed. As the old saying goes that I believe is quoted in the book, that when the only tool in your toolbox is a hammer, no wonder that everything starts to resemble a nail. And truly, the nails at this point are not going in anywhere near straight. And I don't want to go into the examples of that, except maybe to go over just one brief example to help us understand what we're talking about here. Robert Repetto of the World Resources Institute gives this example in a monograph he wrote on the topic. Take the toxic waste dump, and which wastes are seeping into the aquifer. Now, the aquifer has been damaged, and yet there is no debit in any sense at all to the accounts, despite the fact that the ecological infrastructure supporting the economy has been damaged. On the other hand, if government spends money to clean the mess up, that's counted as measured income, because government expenditures are part of the final expenditures of goods and services that constitute GNP. Whereas, though, in opposition to that, private industry, if they're even under a court order, went around cleaning the mess up, that would not show up in the GNP accounts at all, because that would be counted as an intermediate, not a final expenditure. And lastly, if the nearby residents found themselves sickened by drinking the polluted and contaminated groundwater and their medical expenses going up, this would count, strangely enough, as measured income, and would show up as indeed an increase in GNP. So there are all these contradictory signals that we're getting through the GNP accounts. Now, as an economist working in the progressive tradition, or one aspires to anyways, I appreciate the inclusion of income distribution in the index. The Reagan years were marked by the longest so-called economic expansion in peacetime history, yet it's obvious that much of that so-called growth involved the shifting of cost and shifting of burden onto the working class, onto future generations, and onto the environment. I consider it particularly telling that the index reveals the tendency in GNP to mask the political and economic realities of our era, to say, and also the ecological realities that are mentioned. And these costs, as we've discussed somewhat during this conference, are often shifted to the urban poor. We've indeed experienced growth in the last 10 years, but we have not experienced much in the way of development. And the type of jobs generated by this growth are in themselves suspect. As William Sloane Coffin mentioned in his visit to Madison earlier this year, the fastest growing job category in the private sector is security guards, and the fastest growing job category in the public sector is prison guards. I find this very disturbing. But as an environmentalist, I have my doubts about the index. To borrow a phrase from Carl Polanyi, I'm concerned about a certain economistic prejudice that seems to be inherent in economic indices and environmental counting. And what do I mean here by an economistic prejudice? It seems to me that when we're dealing with the environment, we're dealing with multidimensional phenomena. And the permutational range of the millions of species on this planet, the environmental interrelationships between those species must amount to the billions or trillions. It's true that the natural order of ecosystems are stable in only a very complex states. For example, the Amazonian rainforest, the wetland marsh in northern Wisconsin, et cetera, et cetera. But when we try to manage these ecosystems, isn't it true that we often just simplify them into monocultures? I'd say by the same token, when we try to do environmental accounting, we end up compressing this complex multidimensional phenomena into a single point on a yardstick that's denominated in dollars. And as the Swedish environmental economist Peter Soderbaum has noted, approaches that reduce multidimensional complexity to one dimension, whether in money, utility, or points, may certainly simplify matters, but only at considerable cost in terms of relevance. What we're doing is, in a sense, adding to the problem, because these market values and these prices don't rise in a vacuum. They're influenced by the very nexus of norms, conventions, laws, customs, habits that constitute the very institutional arrangements we wish to challenge. And to quote another environmental economist, this time Richard Norgaard of Berkeley, if we use existing market values to aggregate environmental services, then our environmental indicators will necessarily incorporate the failures of the existing institutions we seek to correct. In reference to the metaphor of addiction, a person who has trouble smoking cigarettes realizes, he or she is not a dummy, that the smoke that they inhale will damage their health, that the smoke that they give out will damage the health of their friends and their family. And moreover, they're probably aware that the tobacco industry, the tobacco crop damages the land resources, depletes the soil resources, yet they continue smoking. Now, we're aware that our addiction to this consumeristic lifestyle is fundamentally damaging. We were warned of it in 1978 when Jimmy Carter said, hey, the energy crisis is the moral equivalent of war. Now, some people turn back their thermostats, put on another sweater, put on another blanket, but by and large, we ignored that warning so that we had to fight the literal equivalents of war at the loss of over 100,000 lives and ecological devastation in that part of the world. Seems to me that rather than playing into the addiction, we need to challenge. We need to go on, I don't know, a global 12-step program and kick the habit. I mean, we need to get off this addiction. And I don't think that using an environmental, an index that in a sense feeds the old way of looking at things is the way to do it. I would suggest that I think we're dealing with what's called bounded rationality here in the face of unbounded ecology. We're dealing with a big task, as Herman Daly introduced this session. Now, we don't really have an idea of how the economy and the environment interact. This is all very new. In fact, I don't think economists have much of an idea how the economy functions. They don't have much of a model of that. We're certainly nowhere near getting a handle on how environment and economy interact. But it's new. This type of systems work needs to be encouraged. My comments are not meant, despite the fact that they've been provocative, are not meant to undermine this index, but rather to suggest that it may not in fact be prudent to rely on one all-inclusive number derived by a single methodology, but to be pluralistic, to use several different indices. In the course of devising a new general ethos for society, new tools such as the index will arise, tools which will break through boundaries established by dated paradigms and outmoded means of analysis. There will be hammers, yes, in that toolbox, but there'll also be saws, plumb lines, compasses, levels, et cetera, et cetera. Thank you, Professors Daly and Cobb, on the behalf of everyone here, for helping us add to our toolbox. Thank you.
We have a great, I guess, reverence for empiricism and in this country and indeed within the disciplines. However, and certainly economics would like to see itself as an empirical discipline. However, after so much of what we discussed today, the deductive aspect of economics comes across to me so dramatically. Axioms, modeling, unexamined assumptions, and so forth. I think there's a real kind of contradiction here, and it's a very curious and interesting one. And certainly it's one that I would think would be very embarrassing internally to a discipline that would like to see itself as empirical, and I'd be happy to have you comment on that. Second thing that I'd like to have you comment on is the whole issue of value. Insofar as economics wishes to model itself on, quote, hard science, I suppose it would like to be valueless. Now, if it's valueless, then it seems to me that it has no business making decisions about ends and about goals and so forth, and it becomes sort of an instrumental undertaking. It ought to be told what the goals are and ask, well, how do you get there technically? That would be one stance. Or if indeed it would claim that it has an interest in value, then it seems to me that we get into a whole discussion, the territory for an economist moves into a whole territory of values, of philosophy, and other matters which really are extra, which are really external to the functioning of the discipline. So I guess on these two levels, the empiricism and the value thing, I'd be curious as to what you might say.
That was the great hope of the new discipline of econometrics, was that it would make economics now an empirical science, give it a really a much firmer foundation than the mere casual empiricism of the past. And so with great hoopla, econometrics became really important in the field. Maybe a little cynical, but I think the basic result is that no important theoretical difference really has been settled by econometrics. That different theoretical schools each have their own econometricians, which come up with their own interpretations and models and ways of looking at things which support that view. That may be a little bit cynical, but if I'm not correct in saying that no important economic theoretical dispute has been settled by econometrics, there exists an easy means of refutation, which is to point to one. So maybe there is, but I'll be eager to hear it. On the valueless and value-free, well, I don't know. Economics has just, I suppose, like so many social sciences and even the humanities now, it's just retreated from the whole question of ethics and values. And I suppose it's, as near as I can figure out, it's because of an unwillingness to kind of take fundamental responsibility for value judgments. It's much easier to count than to judge. And I just, I'm going to pass that one on to somebody else to comment on. I really don't, I'm distressed at this idea that science has to be value-free. Paul Ehrlich calls it physics envy, that economics just, everybody wants to be like physics, and so that's why you do it. And that seems real, it seems likely to me. But that's the fastest way to be considered within academia and academic economics departments now, to be unsound, is to show too much of an interest in values and ethics. And I just deplore that. I don't know what to say.
It occurs to me that economics as it's practiced today is anything but value-free when we discuss the notion of self-interested behavior being part and parcel with economics as it's taught and practiced. It concerns me that economics education, K through 12, and then into the principles of micro and macro, presented in the terms of a kind of value-free, positivistic inquiry, is troubling, because that means generations of high school students and college students are being taught that self-interested behavior is, and by extension ought to be, the norm of market society. But that's not value-free. We know that's value-laden. And we saw what happened when the war in Vietnam ended, and a lot of the social activism that was attendant to that began to wane, and people then went on to their MBAs and their BMWs. And instead of showing up at the recycling center, they went to the tennis course. And I believe that this is a product of this emphasis upon individual self-interested behavior. And actually, we're running out of time, aren't we? It's Economics is beginning to resemble an intellectual parlor game practiced and studied by the few, but boring and irrelevant to the many. People want a public discussion of values in face of the global environmental crisis that we're facing. And I think it also shows that to be, in this day and age, when so much is at stake, to be value-free is to become valueless. So if economics wants to have a voice in the policy debates of the future that come in terms of coming to grips with global environmental crisis, we need to abandon that myth of being value-free.
You obviously stirred us up, and I simply wanted to say that in addition to the alternatives you were suggesting of deductive and empirical, I would like to put in the notion of historical, because I think the real problem is that once economics decided to be a science, it ceased to think in historical terms. And I'm convinced that, I mean, you can have a science if the basic situation remains unchanged relative to what you're doing. But that's a totally inappropriate way to approach human economic behavior. That is relative to culture, and it changes over time, and the kinds of economic policies developed all to change the economic behavior. It should be studied historically, and I think the lack of that in economics departments is more serious than the lack of the empirical.
If you take as a fundamental starting point the vision that the economy is not an isolated circular flow of buying and selling, I mean, that's a little part of it, but that's really way up, far abstract. We take a more concrete vision that the economy is a open subsystem. Matter and energy comes in and goes out, an open subsystem of a larger, closed, finite system, the total Earth ecosystem. And a closed system means that matter only circulates, that energy comes in and goes out, but matter stays the same. If that's the basic vision of the economy, the pre-analytic vision, then the first analytical question that occurs to one is, how big should the subsystem be relative to the total system? The total system's finite. How big should or can the subsystem be? Do we have any measures or any quantitative notion of how big we are relative to the total system and how big we could be or should be? Well, I think the best index that I have been able to find comes from the work of some biologists named Vatusik, Ehrlich, Matson, and others. They published in Bioscience a little article which attempted to measure or estimate the percentage of net primary product of photosynthesis which is preempted by the human species. So the net primary product of photosynthesis is a very important thing. It's the solar energy captured by everything that's capable of photosynthesizing, green plants basically, minus the amount of energy that those plants need for their own maintenance and reproduction. So it's the surplus left over for all other forms of life which cannot perform photosynthesis. And they came to the conclusion, or they calculated, that for the globe as a whole, roughly 25% of this net primary product of photosynthesis is directly or indirectly appropriated by human beings. So that includes not only the food and clothing that we directly use, but it also includes paving over of land which could have supported photosynthesizing organisms. It includes desertification and modification of ecosystems that reduce their capacity to photosynthesize, some intervention for human purposes. So that reduction is debited to the human account, which seems reasonable. So 25%, and that's for the globe as a whole, both terrestrial and aquatic. If you only look at terrestrial systems, then the figure rises to 40%. And terrestrial systems are a bit more relevant for us as terrestrial animals. So, but even taking the 25%, that struck me as rather important, because that means that you have 2 more doublings before you get to 100%, 25 to 50, 50 to 100. And a doubling time is on the order of 35 years. So it seems that we've all, as an index of relative fullness of the world, that is fullness of human beings, that seems rather striking. That is that what I draw from their notion is that we cannot double 2 more times. I mean, we cannot increase by a factor of 4. The present scale of the human economy will not increase by a factor of 4 in its physical dimensions without destroying the larger ecosystem. I mean, already there's plenty of evidence that we're destroying that system. Imagine a factor of 4. Well, I think beyond a certain scale of the economy, growth, in its literal sense of physical expansion, begins to destroy more values than it creates. So that economic growth gives way to an era of anti-economic growth. That is, growth for which the extra costs are greater than the extra benefits. Growth which makes us really poorer rather than richer. We're not used to thinking of growth as making us poorer, but certainly it does if it increases costs faster than it increases benefits. So the argument frequently made that, we must grow more in order to be able to afford the cost of cleaning up, to be able to afford helping the poor, to be able to afford this and that. All of that presupposes the very answer to the issue under debate, namely, is growth really making us richer? Well, I think there's plenty of evidence that at the margin growth is not making us richer. It's reducing our capacities to solve all of these problems. And so we have to move back from that and stop talking about sustainable growth and green growth and all this other kind of growth, but recognize that if sustainable development means anything at all, it means development without growth, development which is qualitative improvement based on physical constancy and balance at some level, which is within the assimilative and regenerative capacities of the ecosystem.
Fortunately, there are encouraging signs that we as a society are beginning to develop a conservation ethic that ultimately will flower into a powerful social, political, and economic force. The sooner, the better. If we're going to succeed in raising a conservation generation soon enough to have a significant impact on the future, we need to heavily emphasize education. Every state needs to do what the state of Wisconsin has done. That is, mandate environmental education K through 12. Wisconsin's program is being copied right now by a number of states, and it's an encouraging process.